There's a common criticism lodged against Substack that its model of paid subscriptions could never support original journalism, and instead it only caters to the kind of opinion journalism that can be churned out at a high rate. Eric Newcomer is proving this criticism wrong. After 6 years spent reporting at outlets like The Information and Bloomberg, he struck off on his own and launched a newsletter that covers startups and venture capital. Within months of his launch, he broke several major stories about top VC firms like Andreessen Horowitz and Sequoia. In our interview, Eric talked about his motivation to leave his job in traditional media, his monetization strategy, and how he manages to break major stories at such a consistent rate. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Business of Content, the show about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Business of Content wherever you get your podcasts. And if you work in the content business yourself, then you need to subscribe to my media industry newsletter. It has over 14,000 subscribers, including executives at just about every major media and tech company. Sign up at simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Eric. Hey, Eric, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Super excited.
Yeah, so big fan of your newsletter. You write about startups and the VC space, but I want to get into your origin story a little bit because I always find that interesting. You're one of those full-time newsletter writers who first spent a considerable amount of time working in traditional media, kind of learning your beat, finding sources, building kind of your own audience. How did you first break into journalism?
Yeah, well, it's bad for business. I should be one of these anti-reporter people who can be like, oh, screw the media. Like, subscribe to my Substack because media is so bad. No, yeah, I was an anchor on my elementary school newscast. I moved to Macon, Georgia when I was in fourth grade, and there was a local TV news anchor who ran sort of a closed circuit broadcast, and I was one of the main anchors in elementary school. So I was the editor of my high school paper. I started interning at the Macon Telegraph right after I graduated from college. I was the editor of my teen board page. In some ways, I feel like I'm one of the last people who really made it into journalism, sort of climb up your regional newspaper route. I was the Macon Telegraph, the Sun Sentinel, the Tampa Bay Times, and then I was a New York Times Metro reporting intern right after college.
So you interned at all those kind of local newspapers.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's a little, I'm a little bit older than you. Usually it's that you actually work at these newspapers for like 2 or 3 years at a time and make your way up. But you had a little bit of an accelerated, you interned at the New York Times, and then your first like actual real full-time reporting job was at The Information, right?
Well, I've cut out of my LinkedIn. I've now become I'm old enough that I like cut out a 6 month stint. I was at the Washington Examiner covering DC City Hall, which was like a whole bizarre episode. And they shut down, it's sort of a conservative publication that had like a pretty reasonable local paper, and they abandoned the reasonable paper effort. And so I had a long time to search for what became my sort of most important job, which was going to The Information before it was started as the first employee. And that's what got me into tech report.
Yeah, the Examiner was one of those free tabloids that they handed out as you were heading onto the Metro to your job. That reminds me of a DC that doesn't exist anymore. So like how did you get the job at The Information? So I think most of my listeners know what The Information is. It's started by Jessica Lessin, a former tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal. She basically went out. I don't think she raised any money. I think it was kind of bootstrapped and launched this like $400 a year subscription, hard paywall publication geared towards the tech industry. I think when you started, it was not that long after it had launched, right?
No, it hadn't even launched. I mean, we were she just incorporated like the weekend before I joined, and we were publishing for a while on jessicalessin.com. The Washington Examiner had shut down fairly gracefully, so I had this long window to sort of search for the next job, and I'd lined up a job at the Philadelphia Inquirer, so I was going to go work there. But I'd been on the Harvard Crimson and sort of like, scrambled around that network to try and find if there was anything interesting. And Jessica, is older than me, and but had been in that network, and so I think she just liked the idea of sort of a hungry young reporter to sort of be on the team early. And so that's how Amir Afradi was like, she knew he was coming from the Journal. He's like a very senior editor, but I beat him to joining what became the information, and had the most painful call of my life. I really do think it was one of the most painful calls, telling the Philadelphia Inquirer that I wasn't coming, because, it felt in some ways like, oh man, local journalism, you're like screwed. Like, I'm not going there. I'm going to go cover tech instead. And like the Inquirer had a very painful period after that. So I sort of dodged a bullet, but sad that wasn't, I'm very happy to cover tech, but there's an alternative life if local has a great business model where that's where I spend my life.
Yeah. So you were on that traditional trajectory, and then you kind of swerved. So were you interested in tech? Like, what was was it scary going to a startup that at that point didn't have, hadn't proved itself?
It just seemed like the most exciting option. I didn't care about business, like if anything, I should have paid more attention to it. Both my grandfathers were like small. One was like a paper wholesale distributor, and one was like a civil engineer, and they both had small businesses. So there was some sort of entrepreneurship, I guess, in my upbringing, but I hadn't really thought of myself as sort of business interested, much more political interested. And then sort of through the information, and then, I leave to go to Bloomberg, I got sort of a crash course in business and really fell in love with the subject area.
Yeah. So you weren't that interested. Did you have a specific beat, or were you just kind of like a general tech reporter?
Once I started at Bloomberg, which was like a year and a half after the information, I covered startups, and then I covered Uber. At the information, I can't remember. I wrote about a range of stuff. So I think it was just sort of like, which is a hard first job as a reporter, like go write great novel feature stories. So it was definitely like, trial by fire, but I didn't at the information have a specific beat. But then once I went to Bloomberg, I was very private market focused.
Yeah, because like the information was known for publishing very little and only focusing on stories that like moved the needle, that they weren't doing commodity news. They wanted there to be something, really original in everything they did. Was that scary? Because I remember my first years as a reporter.
Yeah, it felt like we published a lot, but yeah. Because I think there were like 3 reporters plus Jessica at that point, and we were trying to publish, I don't know, like, I forget if it was like 2 articles a day. We built up like a backlog, but there was definitely like a hunger for content that, now that they're a bigger publication, I think they've satiated some. But it was a hard period, but I learned a lot.
Yeah. And so you went to work for Bloomberg. You said that by that point you had developed like a beat. Why did you fall into like specifically the startup space?
I mean, so much of these things can be like circumstance. I think Bloomberg had like a startup beat open. I was interested in sort of going to a bigger platform. A friend of mine had gone to work there. I sort of got to know people there. But yeah, Bloomberg, I think, has been consistently one of the best tech reporting outlets, and so it was a great opportunity to go there. Mm-hmm.
So both Bloomberg and the information, they charge like $400 a year. Was that like kind of eye-opening for you? Like, thinking ahead to when you launched your newsletter, that like thinking about like what people would pay for, especially in like a kind of business tech vertical, like Bloomberg or the information. Like, do you think that kind of helped shape your idea for, your future ideas for launching a paid newsletter?
Totally. Being at the information when it was starting gave me faith that it was possible. I feel like Jessica Lesson has been so savvy about identifying the subscription business model early on when there were so many haters. Like the Kara Swishers of the world went, I love Kara, but it went advertising based with Recode and stuff. And like Jessica was very prescient to go subscription. And Bloomberg, because it's a private company, is underestimated in some ways, but is one of the best businesses in the world. It's just amazing. It's a tax on the entire financial system predicated on media and information. Like, if I could build anything, 1/100th the size of a Bloomberg, I'd be, extremely wealthy, and it'd be a great business. And so, yeah, seeing those from the inside and thinking about, everybody else in media, I think, is so cynical and pessimistic. And I saw the information in Bloomberg. I'm like, I don't know. There are amazing businesses to be built, of course, if you write for, wealthy people trying to make more money.
Mm-hmm. So you launched this newsletter in 2020. What was your kind of at that point? Where did you feel like you were in your career in terms of sourcing, in terms of having maybe your own audience, whether it was on Twitter or elsewhere? Like, did you feel like you had reached a point where you were very enmeshed in the beat? You knew the beat inside out. You had like kind of a loyal audience. Did you feel like you were at that point? But once you decided to make that jump.
I wasn't one of these people that had a Twitter following where you could do the math and say, oh, if I get X percentage of my Twitter following, I'm going to be rich. I feel like maybe I had like 19,000 or something when I quit, but I did have strong sources in Silicon Valley. Like Bill Gurley was maybe the first venture capitalist that I told that I was leaving. And he was sort of my first interview when I put up the paywall. I quickly got interviews with, Dara Khosrowshahi at Uber and Tony Xu at DoorDash. So there were definitely like key people in the tech industry who out of the gate sort of gave me interviews that I built relationships with, covering them at Bloomberg. And then I think, there's also just a sense that Silicon Valley is particularly supportive of upstart new projects, and there's a certain cred you get for being an early sort of supporter and someone who gets it. And so I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for the newsletter, and I was able to build even more sources by going independent.
And what was your motivation for launching the newsletter? Was it like just wanting freedom, thinking you could invent some kind of new model for, did you have like a thesis on something that you could deliver that had more value than what you were doing in your traditional job? Like what were the motivations behind it?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of twofold. I mean, one is sort of the boring journalism answer, which is just I thought like Ben Smith's columns were great. I love that sort of voicey reported opinion where like reporting is driving the opinion, but like you just sort of cut through it and sort of say what sort of you think is true and sort of worth thinking about. And I thought Bloomberg had such a boring sort of writing style where I was super worried about inserting opinion. And I had helped create. I was like the first writer I think on the Bloomberg technology newsletter. And they were constantly being like, oh, this is news analysis, not opinion. And it was like, news analysis is just safe opinions that, you can get away with in the Bloomberg world, whereas opinions are crazy, interesting opinions that people actually want to read. So it was just like constantly infuriated by that. It's so boring, like didn't want personality. They've grown on all these things afterwards. I feel like Mark Gurman, the prolific Apple reporter, has way more personality post my departure than before. And then the other piece of it was just like, here I was a startup reporter. And for once, like I didn't invest in companies. I'm a true neutral sort of person, not sort of the grifter class. And like, so I didn't buy stocks or anything. And then here finally was a tech trend I could seize on, which was the rise of Substack and the idea that you could build an independent business. And so I think with the support of my friends in tech who are like, you can't miss this one. I said, okay, there are these two things. One, having the freedom of voice, and two, being able to build my own business and getting on a platform early, which is usually valuable. I think I made the decision right before the New York Times trend story, and maybe it announced it, I don't know, a week or two after. So I was right in the heart of the Substack frenzy.
And what was your launch strategy? It sounds like before you made the leap, you were actually talking to potential sources and mentors and lining up interviews and stuff like that. Did you have like a specific launch strategy in mind when you did it?
I mean, it was like two or 3 weeks after I quit. I mean, I talked to Substack. I mean, the strategy was basically like seize on the momentum of, the fact that you're quitting during the pandemic was certainly appealing to people. I think, especially in the beginning, I had all these stories that I couldn't write at Bloomberg that I wanted to write. So it helped that I had sort of a creativity reservoir. I think a couple months in, my first story was about Sequoia and sort of the drama there. And Sequoia, just finally broke up. So I feel like I was super early on that. I wrote about sort of Andreessen through the lens of its like public relations strategy, and Bloomberg had never really wanted me to write about like the media and sort of overly sort of self-referential pieces on PR. But the strategy was, like tweet it out and hope people retweet it and I think the fact that my last name is Newcomer, I'd love somebody to do a deep data analysis of the people who just love that there's a startup reporter with the name Newcomer. I feel like there's got to be like 10-20% who are just like, this name is so apt, like I'll subscribe, but who knows.
Yeah, I think you like published some really big stories early on. Like I think that was when I'm sure I've read your journalism prior to that, like at Bloomberg and stuff like that, because I've been a long time Bloomberg subscriber. But when I first became aware of who you were as a person is I think it was either that Sequoia piece or maybe it was the Andreessen Horowitz piece. It was like a big, long, deep dive. It was obvious that you were well sourced. You had been talking to people behind the scenes. And I was like, oh wow, this is the thing that people claim doesn't exist on Substack, original reporting. Like there's always this dig they make at Substack that it's only opinion journalism, it's only outreach or only opinion pieces, it's only outrage bait. That you can't build a business around like original journalism. Like did you think about that? Like how am I going to have time to report out these stories and still have like enough of a cadence to attract subscribers?
You find me having come back from being married 2 weeks ago and like haven't published yet this week, have a draft in my inbox that I'm trying to get out between going on this podcast. And so I mean, it is definitely harder to hit the publishing cadence that I think people expect with reported stories. I do think big great stories drive most of my subscribers, and so that works. But yeah, I think the reporting model is more challenging than the sort of like, I have an opinion every day sort of Substack. But I mean, I'm amazed by people who can sit down every day and write like, a Matt Iglesias level take or a Noah Smith sort of sophisticated take. But yeah, it's hard. It's not easy. We haven't seen a ton of it. I don't think like there are a ton of, there are like, there's the Bear Cave and stuff. They're interesting, like short seller. Like obviously, you're interviewing me right now. There are people who make interviews and like reporting like a key piece of their newsletters, but yeah, it's challenging. And I have a reporting intern right now. I'm trying to think about, I'm considering hiring a reporter, so there's a question of the sort of solo creator versus the necessity of newsrooms when it comes to reporting.
Well, I've interviewed Judd Legume, who does like a lot of really good investigative journalism, and I've also read interviews with Casey Newton, who's said similar things. It's like they try to be working on some big blockbuster piece of investigative journalism, but they're also working on a steady cadence of like smaller things that are more kind of analysis or opinion or something like that, because they could publish those on a more regular basis. Are you kind of balancing things that way as well? Like I notice you publish a lot of pieces with like charts and stuff like that. Like what's your kind of, are you always have something big on the back burner while you're trying to publish like smaller pieces along the way?
Casey is so organized, and I admire his level of organization. I mean, he's really good about like focusing on his beat, social media, and like, yeah, having a take. I think he does Monday through Wednesday. He also hired a reporter, and then yeah, when he has a great scoop, he sort of peppers it in to that schedule. Honestly, Newcomer is chaotic. I like these data posts. I've like got a freelancer now who's like a real data scientist, like ex Uber, ex Facebook, like putting them together with sort of my consultation. I'd done some before, but like, with some, I just like to do a mix of stories. I'm reluctant to aggregate. I think one of my biggest weaknesses as a newsletter writer is that like, I sort of like drag my feet on doing a more sort of aggregated piece, but yeah, I mean, I think part of what people like is that they never know what they're going to get. Sometimes like I drop these stories that are like, oh man, I've been reporting for a while. And it's like, I've got like, one of my favorite stories was I had like 7 companies that had raised at $1 billion with less than like 10 million in ARR, like at the peak of the public markets. And it was just the sign on the private markets that things had gotten totally out of control. It had a ton of scoops. And so sometimes, yeah, I drop a lot of scoops like in the middle of a random story. And like, I feel like the variety is part of the fun, but I feel like that chaotic sort of persona also makes me a sort of inconsistent and sort of, go when the story comes sort of newsletter writer.
And what's your conversion strategy? Like, how are you using your free content to convert people into like paid subscribers?
Paywalls are the best. Paywalls are my whole strategy, honestly. Like Substack has been great recently on building my free list with recommendations, but I find that the best subscriber moments are like have an awesome story. Often I'll write like a narrative at the top, and then halfway through I'll have a paywall, and I'll say behind the paywall is like some key charts or like real information or like and scoops and all that. I do feel like the best, one of the most reassuring things about media in the Substack era to me is that like, yeah, my best stories like generally do the best. Now I'd say often it's like the best stories in the vertical of like, here's some real intel that will help you understand like your competitors and like major players. Like my biggest investigation was probably into Palantir. Like, I broke the news that Palantir was investing in SPAC companies that were turning around and making deals with Palantir, like potentially round tripping revenue. I don't know if that investigation was like a big subscriber moment, but certainly reporting on Kotu and Tiger like were huge subscriber moments for me.
And you also have a podcast where you're interviewing like top VCs and startup founders and stuff like that. How does that kind of fit within your newsletter strategy?
I love it, first of all, and it's like a fun way to talk to people. I think it's, I've originally my podcast for a while, it was like a little sort of tech media commentary. I was hosting with Tom Dotan. It was called Dead Cat. Then I sort of pivoted it to be more in line with the newsletter. It's just called the Newcomer Podcast. I'm on YouTube now. And yeah, I think it's more in line with like the type of person and conversation that I would have in the newsletter itself, which I think is sort of more logical. But yeah, they're just sort of like, it's a fun moment to talk about what's in the news with some of the key news players. One of my favorite episodes was with Lawrence Tosi, who'd been the former CFO at Airbnb and Blackstone. And so he's sort of this like classic behind the scenes player that if you're in Silicon Valley and really get it, you're like, wow, that's not somebody who does a lot of interviews and that maybe sort of the public person understands, but the real behind the scenes players does. And then I was talking to him about the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, like right as it was happening. And he had all this analysis and he'd had startups that had to move out money. So to me, it was the perfect sort of on the news with the player who's really like key to Silicon Valley, but not necessarily. It doesn't need to be sort of someone who's super famous.
How do you feel like that fits into your strategy, though? Like, do you feel like people who listen to your podcast might be more likely to convert into paid? Do you think you're like, I've heard some podcasters or newsletter creators say that like it helps create like this parasocial relationship that makes someone more likely to, want to support you and stuff like that. Do you think along those lines at all?
I do think, if someone likes your podcast, that is just such a level of affinity for you that is clearly valuable. I think the contradiction of the newsletter and podcast is that it is easier to get newsletter subscribers because it takes much less time to consume a newsletter and it's super efficient. Whereas consuming a podcast is a lot of time. And so when you have their attention, it's super valuable, but I think it's a heavier lift. And my podcast is probably a little bit more general audience and my newsletter is a little more niche. So in some ways it's funny to have the newsletter be sort of a larger audience, even though it's a little wonkier. But my overall goal is just like, I think a podcast is obviously valuable. Like I want to have sort of like a big podcast audience. And then once I get to a larger audience, sort of, I could paywall parts of it. I mean, that's clearly what Substack wants, right? To paywall the end. I think I just want a bigger audience before I do that. I've run like pretty lucrative ads on the podcast. I also publish the podcast over the newsletter and I'm trying to improve the quality of summary posts. So I think even if you're just like a text person, you don't write about it. It's like, okay, I get a sense of what's happening based on these summaries of the podcast. And like when it's a topic I really care about, I can jump in and then over the long term, trying to convince people. I think I'm underselling the podcast in some ways. It's been sort of a high ranking tech news podcast at various moments. Like during Dead Cat, we had an amazing interview with Emil Michael, who is Travis Kalanick's deputy. So there have been some great ones, and I love the format. So it's just like, it's an obvious, like, logical pair with the newsletter, but yeah, still want to keep growing it.
So you launched in 2020. How long did it take you before you felt like, that you felt secure, that you felt like you had made the right decision, that maybe you hadn't fully replaced your salary, but you at least knew that you were on the trajectory to do it? How long did it take before you felt really confident that you had made the right decision?
Trying to pull up my stats. I mean, honestly, I was extremely fortunate and I didn't have like a second job. Like, when I quit, the newsletter has been the whole thing the whole time. I start getting paid subscribers in October 2020, and by February 2021, I had more than 1,000 paid subscribers, and I was charging like $150 a year. So within 5 months of launch, I was pretty secure that like this was going to work.
Yeah, that's great. And then since you've done that, like, obviously Substack has rolled out a lot of new tools. You mentioned the recommendations feature. There's the feature that allows you to send out a excerpted version of the newsletter to your free list with some of it behind the paywall. There's also Substack notes now. Has your strategy changed from the beginning in terms of how you're utilizing these different tools to drive either new people into your free list or convert them into paid?
Well, the paywall, it feels so table stakes now. It's insane they didn't have that in the beginning. So that I take for granted, and I don't know if I'm willing to compliment them a lot for rolling that out, but great to have it. The recommendations, have been huge, and has really driven my free list. Now, that free list doesn't convert as well to paid as the people that I earned on my own, which has honestly pushed me more towards like selling sponsorships, which isn't necessarily in Substack's interest, but has been, being able to sell sponsorships has allowed me to hire like a business employee, which helped me throw an event, which was super, which has been transformational for my business. In March, I hosted a Cerebral Valley with some friends at Volley, and we had the CEO of Stability AI, Replit, Hugging Face. We had partners at Sequoia and Benchmark speaking, Cotu. So that was like a big deal for the newsletter, and definitely is going to be a big part of my business going forward.
Well, speaking of sponsorships, like, what has your strategy been there? Because, like, as you mentioned, Substack isn't directly supporting them, but there are various newsletter creators who are allowing sponsorships. Like, are you actively trying to sell them, or do you just have like a media splash page?
Yeah, reach out to me, Eric at Newcomer. Am I allowed to sell? Eric at Newcomer.co, and the newsletter is newcomer.co. Yeah, I mean, I think, the key that I want advertisers to understand is like, board members at startups and public companies are on this email list, right? It is like, if anything, what I've been successful in doing is getting a lot of the top, most senior people at venture capital firms and startup founders following it. If anything, where I need to grow the most is sort of the tech aspirational class. Like, I feel like I'm a much better, like, I sell this, like one of our first advertisers was Vanta, which is selling like SOC 2 compliance to startups. So it's like convince like board members and startup founders like to think about Vanta. I think that makes a lot of sense. I feel like I'm maybe a little away from I just don't think it's necessarily the like buy like coffee Cometeer or whatever. Maybe eventually I should get some of the Ferrari ads just with like a pretty wealthy type audience, but yeah, I want like real brand advertising. I'm charging like a pretty big premium over whatever, I don't know, click through conversion that you would ask for. And also because I don't want it to be like full of ads. Like, I only want to run ads if they're like super premium. For the conference, we sort of bundled newsletter and conference ads. So like Samsung Next, Samsung's venture firm, and then a partnership of Salesforce and NVIDIA were our top Cerebral Valley sponsors, and they also, as part of that, were buying sponsorship in the newsletter.
So the people buying the ads, they have products or services that cater specifically to startup founders.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Samsung Next, wants any AI startup to think about them as a potential investor. Oracle, Nvidia, are selling basically sophisticated compute to AI startups. So it was like, okay, we have these very lucrative things, sort of, and if we reach like, one even like great deal, like it would be super valuable. And so that's the kind of thing I want, and also, I mean, also I feel like there are where I need to do more work is in the sort of like, I want to be seen as the top Silicon Valley law firm. I want to be seen as the top Silicon Valley bank. So much of what Newcomer is meant to be is like, it was created in the pandemic in this moment where people moved everywhere. It's like, where is Silicon Valley? Like, I feel like a real authentic place that Silicon Valley is in my newsletter. And so if you want to seem like a key law firm or bank for Silicon Valley, like advertise in Newcomer.
And are like you actively pitching potential advertisers, or is this all based on just inbound people coming into your inbox and saying?
I mean, I have a chief of staff who really like Riley at newcomer.co, who really does a lot of the ad sales at this point. I've done some of it, and then I mean, I do think an amazing piece of it is, and you're probably better at it than us, is like actually just using the newsletter to like do BD, because it is like the newsletter is such a powerful tool in saying we're doing this thing. Like, why don't you like think of us? So we use it some in sales, but some is outreach to people we think are logical.
So you mentioned a chief of staff earlier. You said something about an intern, some freelancers. What's your kind of strategy in terms of expanding it beyond you? Is it just kind of bits and pieces, supplementary stuff, or do you want to be the next, like, follow in Jessica Lesson's footsteps of growing into like an actual more traditional news organization?
I am inclined to build more of a news organization focused on startups and venture capital. I feel like the challenge, I mean, the beauty of a Substack, one that's like fairly successful is, if you're on your own, you have a nice cash flow business. You don't like have to worry about a lot of people. But obviously, I have to write all the stories and like everything sort of hinges on me. If I go on vacation, it's sort of less present. I would like to get to a point where it's like more of a media organization. Right now, I actually have 3 interns. I have one sort of news intern, and then 2 sort of, one pure business and one sort of business hybrid who's sort of working on the podcast and stuff. And that was just like honestly an experiment for me. I haven't really managed a ton of people. Like, what would it feel like to have more people working on projects? And yeah, I think I want to hire another reporter, and it's basically sort of contingent on when my next conference is and how much money I know I have coming in. But I'd like, I think there's, just like so much demand for information and actual reporting about Silicon Valley. And I think, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Reuters, like inevitably they just have to write for a broader audience. And like, I really want to just write for the professional Silicon Valley audience. And I think like sticking to that strategy and being like, this is for Silicon Valley. This isn't necessarily I'm not in any way trying to reach the person who doesn't know who Mark Andreessen, then that's like a differentiated strategy. And also just like focusing on top reporters and like actual news and not being too cynical. Like, I think there's clearly sort of a great market niche there.
And do you envision a future where you're doing very little reporting, where you're acting more like a CEO or publisher or editor and kind of no longer responsible for like the day-to-day production of content?
No. I mean, I want to be, hosting the events, hosting the podcast, doing great reporting, doing great scoops. So I want to be out there. Like, I think me being in the mix will always be key to it. And it's, I love writing. I love like the great in-depth stories. So I think I'll keep doing it. I think, in the long run, if I had like unlimited resources, I would, hire a managing editor, and I would be sort of out there as like a lead reporter, and then I would be sort of feeding my reporting to other, it's sort of similar to what Kara did with Recode, where like she was out there, she had staff sort of running a lot of the day to day, and then she had other super strong reporters. I think their business model was wrong, but I think sort of her approach and what she wanted out of it, are similar.
I think she was also just impatient. Like she sold to Vox Media very quickly. It was not that long.
Weren't they burning a lot of money? I mean, they also raised on venture. Like a key thing with the Substack is like, I'm not even like all of it is funded off of profits. You know what I mean? Like it is not even like people, they're like, oh, you have some money, you whatever. Everything is based on the actual cash flow of the business that I'm doing. And that's why I'm like, when I think about an employee to hire, it's like, okay, well, what's the cash flow look like? And like, given I have more sort of one-off revenue rather than recurring, I have to think about like, what's the pace of the conferences we're going to have. But those types of considerations are what build sustainable businesses, because I have a very strong sense of like, what do I know I can produce? Like I have no certainty on the amount of revenue a new reporter, that's going to be an experiment. So I basically want to be able to do it with the expectation that they're not immediately going to generate a lot of additional revenue on their own. So I think building, despite covering insane startups that raise a ton of money and spend without sort of necessarily having their fully plan baked, I think with a cash flow based business, there's sort of a forced rationality in terms of how you run your business.
Yeah, they certainly came out swinging versus, with the huge VC raise, they probably hired a lot of reporters and probably had an expensive office or something like that, versus if they had just kind of maybe just raised a small amount and maybe only one or two reporters and kind of grew organically maybe. But I do remember they just sold so quickly, and it just felt like, well, they didn't really see that experiment through to see if they could build that into a profitable business. And so like, do you feel like, I know this is, a big question, but do you feel like you do represent some form of journalism of where it's going in terms of, not every journalist is going to go through that traditional path that you and I had of starting out at like a local newspaper and slowly kind of working their way up, that there's this opportunity to, all the tools are coming online to, you really could kind of build some kind of career on your own without needing institutions? Or do you think you're more of an outlier?
I mean, my big media take at the moment is that creators and journalists like are on an obvious collision course, and that I think where my take is unique is that I feel like there are a lot of journalists who want to cling on to the journalism distinction. Like there is sort of a priesthood of journalism. I'm part of it. I believe in certain principles that are shared by other journalists. I sometimes, go to journalists convention type things and we talk about those principles. But like, I think ultimately journalists should be cheering for creators and journalists to be judged by the same ethical standards. Like if somebody goes on Lex Friedman's podcast and he only throws them softball interviews, his audience and the public should hold him accountable for wasting like a great interview opportunity. And like, I think the sooner we admit that there's just like this collision course and that there are just people sort of doing interviews and that journalism is happening in all these wild forms, and don't just like cleave off journalism as this separate industry, the better. I think there will be, outlets that like the New York Times that have built awesome reputations and they exist as institutions. But I think a lot of media will be in this sort of messy middle of like creators and independent journalists. And right now the creators are, much more focused on their businesses and winning, whereas a lot of journalists are reluctant to get in the sort of muck of like understanding how the business of journalism works and like what they would need to do it profitably. And yeah, so I think, a lot more journalists are going to have to figure out how to build sort of sustainable practices.
Do you think like this kind of trend will give journalists more bargaining power in terms of, how they're paid or understanding what value they actually bring to the news organization? Like I'm willing to bet that you're probably making more money now than you did when you were at Bloomberg. So obviously if someone were to try to hire you to come on and bring your brand on, it would cost a lot more money to bring you on, because how much value from a monetary perspective.
I mean, one of these new media companies did sort of try to buy me, and I was like, oh, you should be trying as a company, like where you look at my how profitable I am and my growth rate versus your profitability and your growth rate, and like what percentage of your business would I represent? And they just wanted to see me much more. And I wasn't eager to sell by any means, but I was curious, and like there was a world if they like provided anyway. But like, they wanted to hire me as just like another reporter. And I think part of the challenge is just, there are huge star people. Like, I mean, like everyone says it. Like, how is Matt Levine still at Bloomberg? There are like enormous deals reporters that I'm like, how do you work for like Bloomberg? And like could make so much money. But I think there are also like tons and tons of reporters at these media organizations that like don't justify their salaries in terms of like the information they deliver, and like the quality is like very concentrated. So yeah, I think the superstars are underpaid and should go independent. And then there are a lot of people who are grumbling, but need to get way more scoops to justify the actual like economic value that they contribute to their media organizations.
Yeah,
that will not be that's not a popular take among reporters. But
yeah, I've heard a variation of that take, that like there's the top reporters who bring in most of the traffic and generate most of the revenue, and they kind of subsidize basically the up and coming reporters who are still getting trained, still learning their beats and stuff like that. And how
that's charitable. That's charitable to frame it as up and coming. Like there are also just like a lot of reporters that obviously there's a lot of important reporting that doesn't contribute to sort of business, and therefore people aren't necessarily willing to pay a lot for. I don't know. It's a complicated situation.
Yeah. Okay, Eric. Well, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
Eric my Twitter is Eric Newcomer. The Substack is newcomer.co. I publish the podcast on YouTube. Search for Eric Newcomer. You'll find me pretty easily. Thanks so much for having me on the show.